to the Industrial Revolution that caught up in America during the early 1800s. Colonial Americans shared access to natural resources and allocated such matters by individual towns. But as technology increased, local governments were becoming more limited and could not control powerful special interests. George Perkins Marsh, one of the first known conservationists, wrote a book called Man and Nature in 1864 in response, which is one of the first works that document the effects of human actions on the environment. His work helped launch the upcoming conservation movement a few decades later. The conservation movement, also known as the nature conservation, is a political, environmental, and a social movement that seeks to protect natural resources including animals and plants as well as their habitat for the future. The ever-increasing industrialization and urbanization marked the beginning of the conservation movement, initiating from the 1870s up until the 1920s. The early conservation movement shifted emphasis to scientific management, which favored large enterprises, and control began to shift from local to federal dominance. It also urged the establishing of national parks, such as Yellowstone National Park, signed into law by President Ulysses S. Grant in 1872, along with several others that follow, as well as wildlife refuges and national monuments intended to preserve noteworthy natural features. In his pre-presidential years, Theodore Roosevelt strongly shaped the path for future environmentalism in America. Roosevelt brought attention to the cruelty and waste of game hunting. He condemned the government's reaction to this as a laissez-faire approach that was too slow and inefficient. In 1887, Roosevelt created the Boone and the Crockett Club in response, which was comprised of conservationists, scientists, politicians, and intellectuals, all whom had a shared goal of preserving wildlife and habitat across the country. When Roosevelt became president, he passed the Reclamation Act of 1902, a federal program that funded irrigation of dry lands and local farms. Other accomplishments were the establishment of the Forest Service, 150 national forests, 5 new national parks, and the 1906 Antiquities Act that proclaimed 18 new national monuments. By the end of his term, Roosevelt had put up to 130 million acres of land under federal protection. After Roosevelt left office, things became uneventful regarding conservationism, as the upcoming presidents didn't contribute much, except Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was also a conservationist. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, FDR established the Civilian Conservation Corps, a program that provided jobs for 2.5 million unemployed people. The workers of the CCC were paid to do tasks such as planting trees, protecting forests, improving natural and state parks, and battling soil erosions. Later on, FDR signed the Tennessee Valley Authority Act on May 18, 1933. The new agency was asked to tackle important problems facing the valley, such as flooding, providing electricity to homes and businesses, and replanting forests. Other steps FDR took towards bettering the environment were building the Blue Ridge Parkway. Personnel from the CCC camps worked on roadside cleanup, roadside plantings, grading slopes, and improving adjacent fields and forest lands. In the 1960s, environmentalism became a mass social movement, drawing on a culture of political ideologies inspired by the swarming civil rights and anti-war movements. In 1992, Rachel Carson, a conservationist and a marine biologist, published Silent Spring, a scientifically informative book that exposes the hazards of pesticide DDT. In her book, Carson also questions humanity's faith in technological progress. Due to the popularity of her book, Rachel Carson became one of the major figures to set the stage for the upcoming modern environmental movement. Around that time, President Lyndon B. Johnson also started taking interest in conservationism. Congress also passed laws that served as significant precedents for future legislature actions on pollution issues, such as the Clean Air Act of 1963, the Clean Water Act of 1960, and the Water Quality Act of 1965. Due to many specific environmental crises in the late 1960s, Congress started regulating environmental quality standards. And to do so, the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA, was created in 1970. The Wisconsin Senator, Gaylord Nelson, wanted to send a big message to the politicians, a message to tell them to wake up and do something. So he organized the first Earth Day, which was on the 22nd of April in 1970 in New York City, where 100,000 people gathered in Fifth Avenue to show their support for protecting the Earth. Thanks to the widespread public support for environmental goals, the 1970s became a critical decade for the passage of federal legislations. In the 1960s and the 1970s, environmental goals enjoyed a nearly unopposed census in Washington, D.C. However, the election of the conservative, pro-business Ronald Reagan in 1980 changed that. Reagan was determined to free the American corporations from the expanding regulatory system. Reagan took advantage and capitalized on the Sagebrush Rebellion in the late 1970s, in which many Westerners transferred their lands to avoid federal regulations. Reagan appointed James Watt as the leader of the rebellion. Watt essentially used his position to portray all environmentalists as radicals outside of the American mainstream. Reagan later appointed Ann Burford as the EPA head, a person committed to ruining the agency's regulatory power, which worked. Between 1980 and 1983, the EPA lost 1/3 of its budget and 1/3 of its staff. Despite Reagan's attempts to undermine the environmental agenda, the American public still overwhelmingly supported environmental goals, and organizations were still able to expand their memberships. The 1980s also witnessed the emergence of the grassroots organizations, groups who opposed threats to their local environments. Threats could range from contaminated waste sites, a polluting factory, or the construction of a new facility that is deemed to be harmful. Because their concerns were locally oriented, they were referred to as NIMBY, not in my backyard, organizations. By the end of the 1980s, environmentalism started to shift its focus on global issues that can only be resolved through international diplomacy. Issues such as global warming, acid rain, ozone depletion, biodiversity, endangerment of marine mammals, and rainforests could not be dealt with merely on a national level. In 1987, the U.S. joined with 139 other nations to sign the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. In 1997, President Bill Clinton committed the U.S. to the Kyoto Protocol, which set forth timetables and emission targets for the reduction of greenhouse gases that cause global warming. President W. Bush, however, broke this commitment when he took office in 2001. In 1996, environmentalists critical of mainstream politics formed a National Green Party, believing that a challenge to the two-party system was needed. Environmentalism and its policies are still controversial up to this day, but the U.S. has greatly improved over the last decades, which gives hope for even further improvement in the future. Thank you for watching.